Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for all the folks who have joined us on this webinar. I think quite a few of you have seen the episode that Dave and I recorded. I think it was about a month ago, Dave, wasn't it? But thereabouts. And so
That's right.
we've got really what we did is we looked at what we were discussing, and we thought actually it'd be good to go through some of those topic areas and come up with some anecdotes, some sort of real world examples. And as we sort of go through those, that might tip some of you into posing some questions, and you'll see those in the chat. And then, of course, if you really pique your interest in terms of what we're looking at, you can also click on the link that we've got in the chat. In fact, the link there. And if you scroll down, there's a form to fill in if you want more information in terms of what Certes can provide in the sort of the IT Agile space. So without further ado, Dave, we won't assume everyone who's on the webinar has seen and sat through our previous episode. So how about a little bit of background, Dave? Tell us a little bit about your background and why you and I are together today.
Yeah, for having me again, and hello to everybody that's in the audience. I spent a large chunk of my career working for a large IT outsourcing organisation before going on my own, and by accident really kind of landed in predominantly what was public sector work. So kind of went into the Agile space. It must be kind of plus 10 years ago. Started working myself and enjoyed it. So I've been doing that for around 10 years now, nearly on my own, almost on my own. It's nice to experience the private sector stuff that I did before that. I've really enjoyed working in the public sector with some really good teams. And that's led me here today, and we had the chance to catch up and chat a little bit more about what that meant from an Agile perspective in the public sector. And here we are.
Thanks, Dave. And actually, what I should have also said for everyone who's watching, because I appreciate maybe some of you are either munching on lunch or you've got somewhere to go to afterwards. Dave and I are going to try and get this closed by 1:45, so 45 minutes. And again, it'll depend on how many questions we get from you guys as we go through. So, Dave, if you don't mind, we'll kick off. So we've got
sure.
a few areas that we took from the last episode. So one of them was there's a view, people say Agile replaces project management. That's one of the things you hear sometimes. And I think, we said it's not quite that straightforward. So what I was asking you, what I'd like to ask you is, in your experience, are there instances where Agile genuinely replaces project management or doesn't it? So could you kind of talk us through some actual examples where that might be the case or not?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. Just to caveat anything I say beforehand, the delivery manager is what a kind of role I fulfill in government, and it kind of embraces a lot of the Agile approaches and the Agile kind of mentality. And you could speak to 1,000 different people who do a similar thing and get 1,000 different answers. None are necessarily right, none are necessarily wrong. It's just slightly different ways of doing things and slightly different views on doing things. So I accept that, some of what I might say might be a discussion point. Some might disagree, some might agree. And that's fine. It kind of depends on the environment. There are so many different factors that influence these sorts of things. But going back to the point there you raised, John, about the Agile versus project management. For the most part, I think there are parallels and there are differences. And I've seen it work hand in hand really well, but I've also seen them kind of work in isolation of each other really well. I'll just talk a little bit about the parallels, because I think there's a misnomer that you don't need to plan anything in Agile. And one of the frameworks I use in Agile is a thing called Scrum. Some people might be familiar with that or read articles on it. And essentially, you work in cycles, maybe 1, 2, or 4 weeks. And it's for me, it's kind of based on a little bit of planning, which means, we need to know how big some of the work is. We need to kind of estimate how long it's going to take. It might take 3 or 4 cycles or sprints. But in which case, you're still doing that element of planning. There's still an element of planning involved in. So there are similarities, there are parallels. Some of the differences are, I think, with traditional project management, is a little bit more around commercials. There's a bit more about, the kind of financials and the forecasting and the risk management, and all that. Certainly in the roles I've been engaged in, still plays a little part even within an agile world. So I do think that even though the difference is there, they can coexist. And I find as part of my role, all these things come in almost day to day, so they're not mutually exclusive. But one of the things I would say that makes a big difference is how the team operates in an agile. It's much more, I find, quite dynamic, a kind of team arena. And a lot of what I see in agile teams, and probably what I will allude to in some of the future discussions that we're about to have over the next 40 minutes or so, will allude to the people, the interactions, how people are. So it's very people focused, certainly in my experience.
And I think one of the points you made was, just because you're doing it through Agile Delivery, it certainly doesn't mean there's an endless budget. So every piece of work has to be
Yes.
has to be managed. An agile approach doesn't just say we iterate forever. That's quite a kind of a very sort of a simplistic view of agile.
It is, yeah, and I think it's that I think for me, what you try and do is kind of deliver value quickly. That for me is one of the big advantages of that agile approach. There's a kind of essence of let's build a kind of minimal thing very quickly, or as quickly as we can, that adds value to the users. And I think over frameworks, things like waterfall, where you typically have to gather all the information up front, and then you can start to refine it, then build it, and then deliver something at the end of it. It works in some environments, definitely, but when you want the ability to deliver a little bit of something sooner, that you can build on and iterate on and get feedback from, then actually, over a period of time, even though there's an element of planning involved, you're still able to do that. And like you say, in both instances, there isn't an endless budget. There's a finite amount of finance to cover these things. So there still needs to be an element of control over the financials of whichever framework you're using in whichever environment you're using.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. Okay, so one of the themes that leapt out at us often when we talk about these topics, you think you're going to talk about, one particular area and something else gets drawn out. And I think, Dave, you and I spoke a lot about people, team dynamics, individuals, etc., as being something that really gets sort of almost heightened, or you get the spotlight when you're taking an agile approach. So what I think we didn't get into too many examples, but and there might be some comments coming out of this, because I don't want to say a sort of a black and white, what's it like to work with a good team versus a bad team, because any leader who says they've got a bad team is probably needs to take a look at themselves. But there's certainly challenges, isn't there? When you've got a group of people that you're putting together maybe for the first time, there can be challenges. You could call it a challenging team. But I was just wondering if you've got any examples of working in that, maybe at the beginning there were challenges, and how you kind of faced those off and got the best out of everyone.
Yeah, I think when you've worked in an environment, and probably a lot of people here have worked in an environment where you've got good teams and bad teams, and actually what I've found over the years is we talk about maturity a lot in terms of how mature a team is in agile speak. But I think there's also an element of how mature a team is in its kind of interactions, and how individuals get on with other individuals. If you're starting with a new project in a new team and pulling them all together, then clearly it's that team's in its infancy, and it needs time to grow and evolve and build. And I think more often than not, you typically find people want to enjoy the work, want to get on with it, want to get on with the colleagues, and you see the relationships forming from all angles. And I've had the good fortune of working with a lot of, I'll say mature teams, but actually a lot of teams where the interactions between the individuals work really well. Sometimes they need a little bit of nudging. I think kind of the flip side to what we've been saying there around the teams is sometimes interactions aren't what they could be. And more often than not, there are ways to kind of pull the kind of issues out, either directly or, say, covertly. That's what I mean is by a little bit of approaches that we can use to do sessions with the teams that kind of draw out these issues without any kind of conflict, and work out where the kind of blockages or issues might be, and see if we can resolve them. Like I say, more often than not, you can kind of address these kind of things.
So, David, it's great. We've had our first question. And before we get into it, or sort of leading into that question, I made a couple of notes which I think might link into the question we've just had. But if you've never been in an Agile team before, ever, and you've got that first amongst equals, you're sitting around the table with an equal voice as everyone else, you might not be used to that. Some people might find it really liberating. Other people might find it terrifying because they're used to maybe being slightly more passive or having a different kind of role. Or actually the opposite. They might be used to just, they're the person who says this is what we're going to do. So if you could take that and then maybe we could combine it with Sasha's question, which is, we don't get many options to pick your team in the public sector. Mostly do the best with what we have. What I love about that question, Sasha, is it reminds me of being at school where, you have to pick teams, and I think just to kind of broadly put this across private sector as well, I don't think there's a huge team selection that goes on in any environment. You're normally working within a particular organization. So, Dave, does that give you, and we've got another question coming in, which I'll get to in a second, but just in terms of that point Sasha's made about, you've got to do the best with what you have. Do you find that when you're engaging with your folks, you can actually get more than you were expecting out of them?
Sometimes, yeah. I think it's interesting. I think the majority of teams I've worked with have already been established. That there've been very rare occasions where we've started a team from scratch, or certainly a team where I've not known anybody, and you kind of walk into different teams in the same organisation. But you're absolutely right, Sasha. Very rarely do you get to kind of pick a team, or somebody gets to kind of build a team. It happens occasionally, but certainly in public sector, more often than not, you join a team. And you're a team member, you're all pulled together. I think from a kind of delivery manager, scrum master perspective, there's quite an onus then on the individual in my role to kind of try and work out who's doing what and where and how, and what their motives are, what motivates them as individuals, what's their role, what's their understanding. And I've done exercises where you can actually get everybody to say, look, what do you think your role is, and what do you think each of these other individuals' role is? And because it's a kind of level playing field with all the individuals who've got an opportunity to speak, and again, there's an onus on me to try and get individuals to speak, is to say, look, what do you think that person's role is, and what do you think that person's role is? And it's a bit of a matrix in terms of getting individuals to kind of open up a little bit. What's quite strange is that when you have those sessions, when everybody agrees with everything, it's kind of over quite quickly, and it's a little bit, I'll say a little bit dull, it's a little bit humdrum, but actually where you get the real value is where somebody says, oh, hang on a second, I thought I did that, and I thought you did that. And then you start to get a little bit, I'll say contention, but it's actually constructive dialogue, because what you then do is surface some of the issues and say, well, look, then how do we best do this? Let's agree now before we actually get stuck into the nitty-gritty and work out how this work's going to carry on.
Cool.
More often than not, you can kind of get some consensus and kind of move on. But I appreciate Sasha's comment. It is very, very rare you get to kind of pick a team. It's usually there. You land and you've got to integrate.
And so thank you, Sasha, for opening up the scoring, because that's led to two more questions. So with two other folks, so we'll get through them right now. So we'll start off with Michelle's question. So Michelle says, people often from a waterfall background grumble about a lack of documentation with the Agile way of working. What would you say to that person by way of advice, and what should be done in an Agile project to remedy that? So that I've heard that one quite a lot, Dave.
Yeah. I think it again, it's a bit of an urban myth, isn't it, that Agile doesn't have documentation? It does. I think the principle of Agile as a mindset is that bit more dynamic. It's that more flexible, and it's the type of thing you can kind of try and do and get around that differs from the waterfall. It's a little bit more structured in terms of you do this, then you do this, and then you do this. And there are, the work packages, the work breakdown structures that you can have in project management. I think in an agile approach, there is still documentation to be had. You still need the kind of, the designs you might want to use to build something.
Yeah.
We have a lot of documentation in terms of what research is carried out. So it's probably a slightly different, I'll say more dynamic structure of what documentation you keep. Ultimately, you want to know what it is you're building, how it's being built, what decisions are being made, what risks exist. I think all these things still exist. Maybe not in the same way as a waterfall structure, but certainly to a kind of workable level.
Maybe if I could add, Dave, or run this past you, is that they might approach that criticism in two ways. So one would be, are you referring to traditional project documentation? Is that what you mean by missing? So risk register, those sorts of things. Because I think actually you can probably translate most of that into, quite a lot of that into how you're taking things forwards with Agile. And then the second part is documentation around what you're actually making. Yeah. So if you had an Agile project to create a book, literally the deliverables would be all the documentation that goes in. So I think I think it is sort of looking at things slightly sideways, and like you say, Dave, it's a bit some myths that surround it. But I would say for Michelle, I would ask that person directly what documentation they specifically are referring to, because they might shrug their shoulders and say, actually, I actually don't know. I just heard that, as a thing. They might not, but if they do give you a list, then you've got something to go through. You're very welcome, Michelle. Okay, so we got Michael and Louise now. So I'll go to Michael and just tackle this in time order, because Dave, I think we should prioritize questions over the content.
Absolutely.
We've obviously got lots of anecdotes we can still get to. So this is Michael Kirby. Thank you, Michael. How do you counter perfectionists? I love this, because there's that great saying that, isn't there? Perfection is the enemy of progress. Actually, also perfection's a bit of a you're kidding yourself if you think you can achieve perfection. Sorry, that's my little take. How do you counter perfectionists, Dave, whose preference is to get it right first time and not to go through the iterative cycles in development of functionality? Do you have any tips on breaking down the linear process some individuals prefer? And Dave, before you answer this, I think this is another big observation that, and maybe also slightly misguided, that in waterfall you do have this complete view before you start, which I think is a bit of a myth. But it's definitely what Michael's referring to. I think is constantly leveled at folks, particularly if they've never done that sort of work before.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's actually quite a common thing. Not just at the outset, but even when you're building something, there are still, areas where you have to be careful you don't necessarily over-engineer or over-design something. I mentioned earlier on about the kind of starting off small and building the kind of small thing really well, and then kind of working up from there. It's interesting when you get the feedback, or when you're working with something, or you're working with a team. And let's use an example of designing a kind of page, or the design of a front page for a particular service. It's very easy to really over-engineer it or overthink it. And it's the principle of designing something. We have this principle of an MVP, or a minimum viable product, or MVS, minimum viable service, which is like, what's the absolute bare minimum that actually does the function we need it to do? And we try and get that thing built first, because we know it's viable and it's the minimum thing. So we try and build that. And you might do that, and it'll look really good, and it's everybody's comfortable with that. But then, like you say, actually, it needs enhancing. Something's not quite right, or these boxes are in the wrong place. And I think that's where the iteration comes in. So it's not that you never get round to building that perfect thing. It's a case of, look, it's very easy to try and build it up front, and that building up front will take an amount of time. But actually, if you can build the kind of simple bit first, you can actually deliver value first. So what you try and do is kind of focus on the value you can deliver and how quickly you can deliver that value. But then you can enhance that value on each iteration. The other thing I was just going to say on that point, actually, because even now it's a very common thing where somebody might, and I'll stick with the design as an example, it's like, oh, I know we had this, but actually I've enhanced the design. And we get people saying, okay, what about this? This is an enhanced design. It's like, yes, but we kind of need to baseline things And it goes back to the monetary aspect as well, doesn't it? You've only got so much money to be able to do the things you need to be able to do. The way around it, I'll say the way around it, the way I kind of manage these sorts of things is really around kind of setting that expectation up front. It's like, well, actually, what is the minimum viable product? What is it we're going to build now? And getting the consensus and the agreement on that. And then agreeing, well, okay, what are the iterations after that will get it to a point that actually is a really good product. And there is a challenge there, because at some point you probably do need to stop before you actually do start to, the amount of effort is going to exceed the amount of additional value you get. And I think it's being conscious of that, being very aware of that, and everybody having an expectation that that's a thing can really kind of address those sorts of challenges. Because they do happen, they happen in pretty much every team I've worked in at some degree or other. But yeah, like I say, it's measuring that value against the effort.
Yeah, and I always
I hope that.
we might get a prompt back with a thumbs up or something. There we go. Cheers, Dave. Thank you for that feedback on the MVS and MVP that you referred to. I think when people are either anxious about Agile or maybe have an agenda, they hear the word minimum and they don't hear the word viable. But if you put a very logical brain on, which is sort of kind of in this domain, isn't it? It is a viable. It has to be viable. It's not one step under viable. It needs to be viable, and that's a bit like saying, best practice. It's actually a big statement, because you're saying, well, this is the best. So saying viable is a big statement. It's a viable solution at that point.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a few questions building.
Can I,
yeah, go for it, Dave.
Oh, go on. It was just a quick one on the viable. I worked at a product a couple of years ago, and it was interesting because we had two parts of the product. There was a set of users that had to do something up front, and then there was a bit of a lag before another set of users could actually consume the information from the first set of users. We actually used that MVP and the viable product to actually help us deliver something even faster. So rather than building two parts from one from each thing that would allow that flow, we actually consciously designed the implementation of it to say, actually, let's do this bit first whilst we're still building that second bit, because we were conscious we needed a bit of lag anyway to do that. So there was that the viability was actually kind of connected in a slightly different way than we would normally have done that. But that minimum viable, whilst you can build things quicker, it can actually help you with an implementation of something. So there's different ways of looking at what that viability means.
Sure. So thanks, Dave.
So I just wanted to throw that in there.
That's a very good point. So I think this next question that Louise has posted, but it's actually on behalf of Derek and Sally from the MOD. What I like about this question is I think this sort of shows what stage their thinking's at, because you get to a point where you can really see the benefits, and maybe you've tried a couple of projects which you've liked. And apologies, Derek and Sally, I'm not speaking on your behalf because I don't know your specific experience, but from my point of view, you look in and then you start to go, okay, if we want to go large with this, or if we want to start how are we going to manage this transferal from waterfall to agile? So the question is, have you got any top tips or techniques that you can share from moving from waterfall to agile? And here's the key one. It says, especially around the budgetary point of view. If you think about waterfall and traditional, it's quite kind of regimented, and you've got your ETCs and you've got that sort of feeling of certainty at least. What would you recommend? Is there anything you can share with the folks listening around transferring from waterfall to agile?
Yeah, I think there's two or three things. I think probably the first one for me is start small. To take something small that you can work from your waterfall environment that you can actually make viable. You kind of almost back to the MVP, but it's subtly different in as much as to take something that's really small out of your waterfall area and kind of put it into an agile space. And you will invariably have to put some kind of budgetary figure around it to say, well, actually, what is it we're going to try and achieve with that one thing, and how do we know when we've done it? For the braver financial people, they might be willing to let it go to a point. That's a bit riskier, I think. I think invariably requires a proposition to be made, and that proposition has to include a financial element that says, actually, what we want to do is we want to take this small bit, we want to run it in an agile way. You might want coaching, you might want a technical architect, whatever in parts you need to get that minimum piece of work going. You will have to estimate, how much is it going to cost, which people are going to need to do that. And again, you can draw on experience from other people in other areas to get that. And get people to say, well, look, how long do we think this will take? What sort of roles do we think we're going to need? And how do we know when we've achieved it? So there's the SMART acronym, isn't there, about making something measurable, being able to kind of measure your progress and know when you've actually achieved what you wanted to achieve. I think that's probably the kind of single biggest tip I would say. Start small, ring fence something, know what it is that, what does success look like. I think you will need to, like I say, put some kind of financial ring fence around it so that people understand what it's going to cost. And then track it. I think that tracking bit's quite important, because even if you don't achieve the end result, if you've got an audit trail of how you achieved what you did achieve, because things happen, things throw things off things, and sometimes they are viable distractions, but they're distractions nevertheless. Cater for all of that, and then at the end, you will know whether it's worth, well, should we take another chunk from that waterfall? Should we try it with another piece?
Yeah.
So there's an element of testing these things, and along with that testing comes learnings.
Yes.
So you take another piece with the same financial, boundaries or whatever it is you need, with another proposition, with another set of metrics and measures and tracking, and you adopt the learnings from the first part, and then you can see where this is going. Yeah. It's something that you take another piece and do a bit more. There's buy-in to be had. You're going to have to convince somebody that that's a thing, and it might be that it doesn't necessarily work. I think there's the one thing I would say, there's an expectation there that actually invariably something won't work. And we talked about this in the first chat we had, John. It's that learn fast, learn something.
Yes.
And then be able to pull that in.
I've got a build for you, Dave, or just something to run past you. So if some of these questions, and we'll get to Kitty's question next, so apologies, Kitty, waiting for a while, but it is related. If you are doing something like this for the first time, and that it's high stakes, public sector, they're normally very substantive projects, etc. I haven't been a UK public sector employee, but I have worked in UK public sector engagements, what the consultants call client side, so acting as if I was sort of embedded within the teams. And one of the things I was thinking about is that if you've never done it before, if you obviously pick your folks carefully, but having some private sector folks come in with you that have done it before, but with the objective of teaching you, the knowledge transfer. So actually, it's not just about helping you deliver this piece of work in an agile way, but it's also, we'll show you how to do it, and transfer the knowledge with the aim of then.
Yeah.
And look, it doesn't have to be a private sector coming in. It could be another part of government that's had some success with agile. I don't know if then you have a challenge with resourcing and getting people to move around. But I'm just saying, Dave, we're giving some advice, but sometimes it is helpful to get a bit of a leg up, but not with the intention of creating a dependency, with an intention of saying, let's do something together, and at the end of it, you guys can run with it. What do you think about that, Dave? Because there is, you've got to be careful, because if you do bring in a lot of folks, you can become dependent, and then you're not really getting it. It's a sort of a balancing act, isn't there?
Yeah, it is. I would say just start small. Excuse me. I think start small. Take something that's manageable, and I think it goes back to the point I made a moment ago around accepting it as a learning experience. You're not necessarily going to get everything right first time, so take something small that you can work with. And it might not necessarily be the most, don't start with the most valuable thing in your portfolio. Start with something small, start with something basic, there's plenty of scholarly articles and reference material you can refer to on these sorts of things. But just experiment with different approaches, different tools, different techniques in Agile, Scrum, and there's other frameworks you can use as well. So you might only need a very light touch bit of guidance to start with, and I would get some kind of guidance to start with.
Sure.
I think trying to do it without any kind of guidance is I wouldn't say it's impossible. It's certainly not, but certainly more difficult. I think it'd be useful to get that initial light touch guidance. It might just be an ad hoc bit of mentoring or coaching that says, right, we'll try this. What are you trying to achieve? And it's that kind of thing to build up the confidence, to build up that kind of your own arsenal of techniques and tools. Now, I still do that today. I still work with teams where I work with people that do the same role in other areas, and I'll watch what they're doing, or I'll take over a team and somebody say, oh, Mary used to do this. And I will go, oh, okay, that was really good. Did you like doing it? It was like, yes. And so suddenly I'm picking up something I never did before.
Yeah.
And then I'll take that with me to the next thing. So it's just something else I'm adding to my arsenal. So yeah, start small, get a bit of a light touch steer,
Sure.
and yeah, just learn, but accept there's a bit of learning to do.
So I've left Kitty's question, and then Sasha's actually offered an answer, but I'd like to put something over the top actually. So first thing, I'll share the questions. But before I do, just a reminder that Agile, when it was first used, one of the first kind of big examples of Agile being used was in the US. It was a ginormous defense, or it was either I think it was an intelligence project, where they wanted to get all of the records, the data from all the different agencies in one place, and that program ran into difficulty, and they brought in what became the Agilists to actually say, well, actually, you need to look at this differently. So one of the very first uses of Agile was in the public sector, albeit in the US, and it was on a ginormous project.
Yep.
And it was all covered with, and there's, this is very well documented if folks want to look it up. So there is a sort of a necessity is the mother of all invention angle to this, but the folks
Yep.
here are working in the realities of the here and now, and they're referring to some frameworks. So we just get those questions through, and we'll see if there's any more that we can build from Sasha's answer. So Kitty was saying,
Sure, yeah.
Looking at the previous question, have you, Dave, got experience of introducing Agile into government? Our governance frameworks in public sector are often used as blockers to working Agile. So tips on how to challenge this view would be welcome. And then I'll just give you Sasha's response saying, I wonder how the project delivery capability framework, the PDCF, and other frameworks aligns to Agile, like gateway reviews. I don't know if there's a national government framework for Agile yet. So those that was some conversations going on, and then Kitty's referred to collaborating with other departments, and Sasha said yes, and we also have GSS, which is quite comprehensive. So there's quite a bit of content to get into. Dave, have you got any comments over the top of those?
There's a lot to dissect there, isn't there? It's really difficult. I know it can be really challenging in different departments with different frameworks and different governance. We have to remember governance is there for a reason, and sometimes you can push back a little bit or negotiate with these sorts of things. Other times you can't. Governance is there for a reason, and we have to follow it. And certainly in some departments, Agile is probably a little bit more agile than it is in other departments. And it's because of the culture or the environment that they're working that these things have to be there. And sometimes you have to adapt, but not necessarily in the way that you would like. I've worked in areas where there are restrictions and governance that prevent me from doing something the way I would ideally like to do it. But I've been in areas long enough to know that, sometimes you can push back a little bit on these things and get some progress. Other times you can't. So I'd go back to the point of and we talked about this in the first chat we had, John, was, Agile is a mindset. There are the frameworks help you apply that Agile mindset. But even when there's restrictions, kind of go back to the basics of it's about the team. It's about the people in the team. Try to help them do their job. Because yes, you could expend a lot of effort trying to challenge some of these the governance that's in place and not get very far. And if you can make an argument, then at some point up that chain, you will hopefully reach somebody that sees an opportunity to kind of challenge the governance and move on and maybe refine it. But governance is there for a reason. It is really hard. But there isn't. I don't think there's a real single kind of area that would fix this. But don't be afraid to try and challenge it. If you've got that environment, then try and do that. But again, and we might come on to this shortly anyway. But I will reiterate that people side of things. You're working with teams and other people that are in the same position as you or in the same environment as you. Do what you can to help them do their job, especially if they're in your area and you've got some duty of care to them. Try and make it as easy as you can for them. But it can be quite tough with the governments and the kind of various criteria gates that you have to go through. Cool. I'm afraid I haven't got a kind of single quick win tip for that. I'm afraid it's a tough one to crack.
So there's another question that's come in from David Barrow, which we'll get to in a second. But I wanted to kind of relate the topics we've been covering so far with actually one of the areas that we were going to cover with an anecdote. So, folks have been talking about how do you introduce it, some sort of the questions. And I think you were talking about working with a relatively junior PO. Do you want to just quickly tell folks what a PO is? What do they do? And then maybe, because I think that's a really good story that might give some folks some confidence that are listening in about potentially getting involved in an Agile piece of work for the first time.
Yeah, it was a few years ago. I was working with what was a relatively mature team. It was a team that interacted really well. Maybe there was, I don't know, maybe 10 people in this kind of team, 9 or 10 people. It worked really well. We were delivering. Productivity was absolutely excellent. And in the Agile space, certainly in the Scrum world, we had what we call a product owner, so somebody that championed the product and was essentially the decision maker on, the direction of the product, which way was it going to go, how was it going to progress. And we had a bit of a rotation, so we got a junior product owner in the team. And it's quite a senior position. There's a lot of responsibility on the product owner to lead the product in the right direction, to prioritize the right things at the right time. So naturally, there was an element of kind of coaching and mentoring involved with the product owner, helping them along the journey about what they need to do and helping how they need to do things and kind of showing them some of the techniques, whether it be retrospectives and looking back on things, how we did our daily stand-up, planning. So a lot of education, a lot of learning to be done for this junior person. But it wasn't just all on me. I think one of the things I wanted to highlight with that anecdote was actually I was working with the team and I was reminding the team that this was the product owner. And we would occasionally say, oh, we need a decision made on this. It's currently red, it needs to be blue or whatever. And we said, well, that's fine. But actually our product owner is the person that needs to decide that it's blue. We don't just change it. We have to give them the responsibility. That is their role to be able to direct that. And actually it helps them as an individual. So we did that. And there were several times where I kind of had to, kind of encourage people, remind people when somebody said, oh yeah, I need to change this to blue because it's currently red. I was like, well, just double check with the product owner first. And actively saying to them, look, it will help them be in the position of product owner responsibility. And it worked really well. The product owner kind of got that responsibility really quickly. It helped them get up to speed much quicker. So that was a big, kind of big win, I think, for the whole team. We talk about coaching a lot in Agile, and let's get an Agile coach in. But actually, there's a flip side to that, which is if you're in a mature team and you get new people in, actually the team's got a responsibility to coach, not necessarily in a formal way, but to coach or mentor the individuals and get them on board. I say, look, you're this role. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this because you could do that. But if you need a hand, excuse me. So there was that learning experience and that coaching aspect, but from a slightly different angle.
Cool. And actually, David, I was reading your points because I thought it was a question, but actually what David's actually done is made some suggestions in terms of taking on the points that you made, Dave. So if I can summarize for you, Dave, in that you were saying that basically it's good to get a community of like-minded folks. So there's a classic collaboration.
Yep.
So if you can find some Agilists amongst different departments, or maybe you've got the means of setting up something like that, and also to maybe look at a proof of concept. So something that is can create that confidence, and then Sasha was then sharing some links in terms of the frameworks, etc. So, I've got a question here. This is from Michael Kirby, and it's his last question. He says, "Last question from me. Do you have a preferred tool you choose to use in the delivery of your Agile projects?" And if whilst you're thinking, Dave, that says to me, Michael's really imagining doing it, because this is the your next stage you go to is, okay, sounds interesting, but do I use Microsoft Project, or is there a Kanban board, or is it just a spreadsheet, or is it all of the above? What on earth? Is the how do you cover the tooling side of it?
Wow, yeah, it's yeah. I'm gonna. It
So
depends,
the software
doesn't
tooling.
it? I think there's
Michael's just said software tooling side of things. So
yeah. So I think it really does depend. I can't say one way or the other. It depends on the nature of the project, the scale of the project, the size of the teams. I've worked with lots of different tools, and even with the same tools, there are so many different ways you can use them. There are simple tools that you can get to a certain point, and invariably all these tools, one way or other, you can configure them slightly differently. So yeah, I'm kind of going to avoid giving a direct answer.
And it depends.
So many.
So what I would do is I'd offer to.
Yeah,
there we go. Michael just said. I knew you was going to say that with a wink and a smile. Michael,
Sorry, Michael.
if you reach out to us, and Link would absolutely 100% happy to have a quick chat on the phone where we can talk about the sorts of things that are available, and that might be a bit more useful. So that's great. Okay, just checking time. So, crikey, time is flying past, and we've got great attendees and fantastic questions. So, what I wouldn't mind covering quickly, Dave, before we close, is we got around psychological safety at the last session, and I think a lot of the questions that we're hearing here is about how do we start, and what other people are saying about it, and the kind of the naysayers, etc. So would you be able to cover off a bit on psychological safety, and some, you just maybe very quickly say what it is, and then a bit of your experience around it, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So I think the two main pieces for me on this are, one is the kind of safety of an individual. I think certainly in the role I work in, and really if you're working with colleagues, team members, whoever, there's a duty of care to be had. Like, you would want somebody to show a duty of care to you as you would to them. So I think it's very important that people have a sense of that, not necessarily explicitly, but just are comfortable working in a team, are comfortable being themselves. That there's no animosity anywhere, and people get on in a team, and that from an individual point of view is just paramount. I think what you find then is when people have that working in teams, the dynamics, the relationships are much more comfortable. Teams are much more productive, just generally happier. Everybody's able to get on. But it's not like that every single day. People have bad days. I have bad days. And sometimes you need to be able to vent to somebody, or somebody needs to vent to you. And that's just normal. It's be there, be that vent, or know who you can go to if you do want to vent about something. It's just normal, and it's quite healthy to have that vent. Sometimes you might need a bit of a guidance or a bit of a steer, and other times it is just a cathartic release. But it's something that happens in teams. It sometimes needs nurturing. It needs sometimes conscious effort. I think one of the examples that I did as a team exercise a few years back, in fact, it was just after lockdown had started, and it was a team that had been used to working all together in the office. And we were, thrown into lockdown. Everybody's working from home, and we have what we call retrospectives, where we get to reflect on how the last couple of weeks had gone, and what's the work like, how's things working. But for one, after about 6 weeks of lockdown, we did a retrospective that focused on working from home. How were people feeling about working from home? And it was an interesting one because we got individuals to say, right, look, everybody had an opportunity to speak, but before you have an opportunity to speak, what do you enjoy? What don't you enjoy about working from home? And it really highlighted to me that actually a couple of people in the team were really struggling working from home, and they explained their circumstances. And what we were able to do was progress that so that actually there was a space in the office that we were working in that they could open up, provide the right safeguards to working in an environment with COVID quite paramount at the time. It was still locked down, not necessarily straight away, but as soon as it was safe, we were able to create a space that these individuals could actually go into the office and work. But for me, it was again, it goes back to two things. One is it's about the individuals, but you need to give them a kind of forum to be able to highlight these sorts of things, whether it's on a one-to-one basis or even in a team basis. And sometimes in that example, when we got some of the individuals to talk about some of their experience, it was speaking to them afterwards a little bit more on a one-to-one level and saying, well, look, do you want to talk about a bit more? Is there anything you want to articulate on? Is there anything else we can do? So it was a really useful exercise. So it kind of goes back to the Agile is a mindset, and it's very much about people. It's taking people, what is it that I can do to help you, function better, be better. If you're struggling, if you're not struggling, how can we kind of help each other to do what we're here to do? So yeah, that for me, psychological safety, that retrospective, in hindsight, actually turned out to be quite a powerful one at the time, and we actually did a lot of show and tells to say we'd done this retrospective about people working from home, because sometimes in the environments we work in public sector, it's all about the work. Why did that go wrong? What happened here? How could we improve? And absolutely, all those things are core to what we do. But actually, don't forget that people side of things. When throw in a retrospective that's people focused every once in a while, and make sure people feel safe.
Brilliant advice. Definitely,
I'll stop there.
Definitely put in a retrospective around people.
Key thing.
Yeah, for sure. So all good things must come to an end, and the time has absolutely flown past. I did say I'd get us finished at 1:45, and we're a couple of minutes over. But before we leave, I just want to say thank you to Sasha, Michelle, Michael, Derek and Sally via Louise, Kitty, David, and of course yourself, Dave. Absolute pleasure speaking to you again.
Thank you, and thank you everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. This will be available on a playback, and again, if anyone wants to get in touch, there we go. Also, a review of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as well. Yeah, I love that. There's so much content wrapped up in all of this. I'm sure we could do some more episodes, but huge thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Sure.
And I'm going to press a button, which means you guys we'll sort of disconnect. You're very welcome, David. Thank you very much, and we'll
thank you, everybody.
See you.